Hey, it's Roger, creator of this Azure Sandbox. I'm back. And in the previous video, we completed the provisioning of the new VNet on-prem configuration using the instructions here and getting started. So that completed successfully. So let's move on to the smoke testing. So the first set of smoke tests are used to test connectivity from our cloud network, which is our Azure Sandbox, to our new on-premises network that we just provisioned or simulated on-premises network. So we're going to do that by testing to see if we can create an RDP connection to this new JumpWin 2 jump box that's in our on-premises network, and we're going to do that from our cloud network, JumpWin 1, right? So let's go ahead up to the Azure portal, and it's always good to test to make sure that your VMs are started and ready to be connected to. So I can see here all my VMs as part of my Sandbox configuration are running. Here's the new ones, ADDS2 and JumpWin2 that are part of our new on-premises network, okay? So the one that we want to connect to is the one that's in our cloud network because that's the only thing that we have any kind of external way of connecting to through Azure Bastion, right? So I'll go ahead and navigate to JumpWin 1, and we will connect up to that using Bastion. Grab our password from the key vault. Notice we're using, our cloud domain credentials, which is mysandbox.local, because this jump box is domain joined to our cloud domain controller. All right. So we're connected up now to JumpWin 1, which is in our cloud network. And that's going to be our jumping off point for doing everything else in the smoke testing. So the first thing we want to do is see if we can resolve DNS queries to that other jump box that's running in our on-premises network. So I'm going to do that by doing a resolve DNS name jumpwin2.myonprem.local. So my onprem.local is a private DNS zone that is associated with an Active Directory domain services domain in our on-premises network. Let's see if we can do a successful DNS query to that. And we did. The DNS query succeeded, and the IP address that came back is an IP address that's in that on-premises network, 192.168.2.4. That's that miscellaneous 03 subnet that we dropped the jump box into. So now that we know that we can do DNS queries to it, let's see if we can create an RDP connection. So I'm going to go here to Windows, Accessories, and Remote Desktop Connection. And the machine that we want to connect to is the one that we just did the DNS query for. So JumpWin2 dot myonprem dot local. Okay. And we want to connect using credentials for that on-premises domain, not for our cloud domain, which is mysandbox.local. So it's going to be bootstrap admin at myonprem.local are the credentials that we're going to use. All right, this is a good sign. It's just challenging us for a password now. So let's go get our password. That's sitting in our key vault under admin passwords. So we'll copy that out and we'll paste it in here. And voila, we have established connectivity using RDP from our cloud network to our on-premises network to a Windows jump box on our on-premises network. Okay, and so that completes the connectivity testing from cloud to on-prem. We were able to make that connection. So next, we're going to test a bunch of connectivity from on-prem to cloud. And we're going to do that using this RDP connection that we've established with JumpWin 2. Okay, so the first one is we are going to see if we can create an SSH connection into a Linux jump box from our on-premises network to a Linux box that's running in our cloud network. That'll test SSH connectivity over port 22. So I'll just close down all this server manager stuff that's running in JumpWin 2. We won't be using server manager. And first thing we want to do is test to see if the DNS query will resolve, right? So I'm going to do a resolve DNS name against that Linux jump box that's running in our cloud network. So the credentials that we're going to connect with are bootstrap admin at mysandbox.local. And then the host name is going to be jump Linux 1, but it's in a different domain. I'm in the my on-prem local domain here, so I need to specify that domain. So jumplinux1.mysandbox.local, which is the cloud domain that machine is joined to. Let's see, maybe I got something wrong. Bootstrap admin at mysandbox local. Pause. Okay, now that we've got Server Manager closed down, first thing we want to do is test DNS name resolution from our on-premises network this time up to our cloud network, and specifically to a Linux host that's running in our cloud network. So to do that, I'm going to do a resolve DNS name, and it's going to be jump Linux 1.mysandbox.local. And that came back. So that Linux host, the DNS query for that Linux host worked. It came back with an IP address that's up in our cloud network. Specifically, I believe the VNet app subnet in that cloud network. And now that we know those DNS queries are going to work, we should be able to get SSH to work. So I'm going to do an SSH, and I'm going to have to first specify the credentials. So that's bootstrap admin at mysandbox.local, because it's in the cloud domain. And then I have to give it the host name, jump Linux 1. And because it's in a different domain, I have to specify that it's in mysandbox.local. Well, let's see if that works. And it did. So it found the host, It's telling me whether or not I want to continue connecting by storing the fingerprint. And now it's asking me for the password. So let's go grab our password into our clipboard again. And if I right click here and hit enter, I should get a connection. Yes, I do. So here we have an SSH connection from a jump box running in our on-premises network over our VPN connection to a Linux a node that's running in our cloud network. So all that same stuff that we were able to do with this Linux VM, we can do from here. So for example, we've got the Azure CLI installed on that VM, so we could use the Azure CLI if we wanted to. Just wanted to run a quick command just to show you that that node is responding and it's functional. So we're all good there. I'm going to exit out of SSH. We've proven that that connectivity works. So let's see what's next in the smoke testing. Now that we have successfully connected to Jump Linux 1, the next thing we're going to do is SMB connectivity to the Azure Files private endpoint that we have running up in our cloud network. So to do that, I'm going to need to go grab the fully qualified domain name for the Azure Files endpoint in our storage account. So probably the easiest way to do that is just pull up our storage account. And if we go down here in settings, we can go into endpoints and we can copy out the endpoint for the file service here, that file.core.windows.net domain. So I've got that in the clipboard. And now what I'm going to do is run a DNS query against that fully qualified domain name. So we'll do a resolve DNS name, and we'll paste in that host name. And we can take out the HTTPS and everything. And what I'm hoping to get back here is the IP address for the private endpoint for this Azure Files endpoint. And that's exactly what I got back. So you can see here this IP address 10.2.2.4, first of all, is a private IP address in our cloud network, and it's in the subnet that we use for private link, which is how we set up the private endpoint to Azure Files. So that is awesome. That's exactly what I wanted. So next, we should be able to map a network drive to this Azure Files share from our on-premises network, to the Azure Files share private endpoint running up in our cloud network using the SMB protocol, which runs over port 445. So I'm going to do a net use z:, just map the Z drive, and we'll paste in our fully qualified domain name again. Got to get rid of all these HTTP pieces and just use the fully qualified domain name. And then at the end, I got to tack on the name of our file share, which is my file share. And I also have to specify the user. Let me just quick check the syntax for that. And that's in our net use command right here. So it's /user : is the way we want to do that. So it's /user : and we specifically want to use bootstrap admin at mysandbox.local, because remember, we're in the on-premises domain here, so we can't use integrated authentication. We have to fake it out and say, no, we actually want to use a security principle that's part of the Active Directory domain that's running in our cloud network. Sandbox.local. All right, it's wanting the password again. So let's go grab the password. Pasted that in, and we have a Z drive mapped. So here you can see, if I look at my drives, here I've mapped a drive from a jump box on my on-premises network to the private endpoint of an Azure file share hosted up in Azure. So I can, do things on the share now. I can create, folders. Hello world, hello from on-prem. And I can create files in that share. Hello world. Hi from on-prem. So pretty cool. And, SMB connectivity runs over port 445, which is usually disabled on most ISPs. But because we're connecting over our private endpoint over a site-to-site VPN connection, we can get that SMB protocol to work just fine. So that is awesome. Let's unmap that drive. And we can move on to the next smoke test. Let's see what that is from our documentation. So we've done SSH, we've done SMB. Now we're going to do TDS, tabular data stream, which is basically the wire level protocol used by SQL Server. And in this first one, we're going to use it to connect to a SQL Server virtual machine running in our cloud network from our on-premises network. Okay, so same type of process here. Let's go test to make sure the DNS query is working. So I can do a resolve DNS name, and it's mssql win1.mysandbox.local is the host name. And the DNS query worked, and I'm getting a private IP address in that database subnet that we have running in our application virtual network up in the cloud. Perfect. So now that I know that the DNS queries are resolving, we can fire up SQL Server Management Studio and try to connect to that virtual machine, to the SQL Server instance on that virtual machine, MSSQL Win1. So it does take SQL Server Management Studio a while to launch the first time. Okay, so to connect up, we're going to use mssql win1.mysandbox.local as the server name. We can't use Windows authentication because it's in a different domain. So we're going to use SQL Server authentication, and we're going to connect using the SA account, and we're going to need our password for that, which is the same as the admin password. And I click on connect, and bang, we're connected to a SQL Server instance running on a Windows Server virtual machine in our cloud network from a jump box in our on-premises network. Pretty cool. So I can go ahead and exit out of SQL Server Management Studio since we've tested that connectivity, and we can move on to the next smoke test. So I believe that next smoke test is going to be another TDS, tabular data stream smoke test, but this time we're going to connect to a private endpoint for Azure SQL Database. So let's see how that works. So the first thing I'm going to need is I'm going to need to go get the fully qualified domain name for our Azure SQL Server. So we'll open up our Azure SQL Server, and here on the property page, you can see the server name or the host name that is used for that. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And let's see if DNS queries work against the private endpoint for that host name. And that private endpoint, of course, is running in our cloud network. So I'll do a resolve DNS name on that fully qualified domain name, and the DNS query worked. And we are getting an IP address in our private link subnet that's running up in our application virtual network. So that is perfect. That's exactly what I want. So now that I know that DNS queries are working, I can try to connect up using SQL Server Management Studio. So this time I'm going to connect to that fully qualified domain name that we just copied. We're going to use Bootstrap admin, not SA, to connect. And I'm going to need my password. So let's go back out and get our password. Paste that in. And voila! I'm connected to an Azure SQL database service running in Azure from SQL Server Management Studio running on a jump box in my on-premises environment. And I'm doing that connectivity using a private endpoint in our cloud network. And I was able to resolve the DNS zones, the private DNS zones required to do that using the DNS private resolver that's part of this configuration. So that's awesome. That worked great. Let's see what else we need to smoke test. So the next smoke, we've done 2 TDS smoke tests, once to an Azure virtual machine, an Azure Windows virtual machine running in Azure, once to an Azure SQL database private endpoint. This last smoke test is going to be to a MySQL flexible server private endpoint. Okay, so similar process. Let's go find that MySQL fully qualified domain name. So it's a flexible server that we have deployed. And we can grab the server name from here, from the Azure portal. And let's resolve the DNS query for that. So I'll do a resolve DNS name, and I'm going to paste in the host name for that Azure MySQL flexible server. And what do we get back? We get back a private endpoint from the delegated subnet that we use up in our cloud network for Azure MySQL flexible server. So that's exactly what I was expecting. Everything's working really well. Let's see if we can actually connect to it using MySQL Workbench. So let's see here. So MySQL Workbench should be pre-installed on this jump box. It's not because there's an issue right now with the Chocolatey package for installing it. So I'm just going to pause the video real quick and go install that, and I'll come back to you once it's installed. Okay, so I was able to manually install MySQL Workbench. So let's just go ahead and run that. And we need to go up here to Database Connect. And the host name we're going to use is that fully qualified domain name, which points to the private endpoint up in our cloud network. That connectivity is going to happen over port 3306. We're going to use Bootstrap admin as our username, and I'm going to click on OK, and we should get prompted for the password. So let me go grab that. Paste it in here. And voila. I have a connection from a jump box running on my on-premises network to a private endpoint running in my cloud network for Azure MySQL Flexible Server. And I can connect up and I can, start working with my MySQL database up there. So that, I believe, completes the smoke testing. Let's go double check, make sure we don't have any other scenarios that we want to test for smoke testing. So we've done SSH, we've done SMB, we've done 2 flavors of SQL Server, and we've also done MySQL Flexible Server. So we fully tested and smoke tested our connectivity from our on-premises environment to our cloud network. So just a few other things you can explore if you like in the portal. So one thing that you could look at is the virtual network gateway on the on-premises side. So that's the gateway that we use for our site-to-site VPN connection to our cloud environment. And you can see here that our on-prem to cloud connection is showing us status of connected, right? The other thing that you can look at is the same thing in our virtual WAN hub. So if we go up to virtual WAN and we drill down into the hub, here's our hub. It's part of our Azure Sandbox. And if we go into site-to-site VPN, we could see that we have an active connection to our on-premises network, and the connectivity status is connected. The other thing to take a look at would be your DNS private resolver. So the DNS private resolver that gets provisioned as part of this configuration is shown here. And this is pretty lean in the portal perspective. All you can really see is whether you have an inbound endpoint set up, which we do. So that's the inbound endpoint that is used by conditional forwarders in the on-premises network to query private DNS zones hosted in our cloud network in Azure. So if you want to see what those conditional forwarders look like, here we are on our jump box in our on-premises network. And I can open up the DNS tool to look at those conditional forwarders. So our DNS server is running on ADDS2, which is the same machine, which is our domain controller. And if we go in there and we go into conditional forwarders, here's the conditional forwarders that made all those DNS queries work. And as you can see, they're going to 10.1.2.4, which is the inbound endpoint for our private DNS resolver, right? So that's perfect. And then the other thing that is configured for the private DNS resolver is the outbound endpoint. So this is the equivalent to a conditional forwarder in Azure, where you basically say, hey, if you want to send queries to some other DNS server somewhere, we can send it out through this this outbound endpoint. And you can see that outbound endpoint has an associated rule set, and that's where we set up the rules for those specific private domains. So we have one rule for our cloud private domain, which we set up already in Azure, and we have another rule for the on-prem domain. And this is what made it possible for us to create, to do a DNS query against that jump box that was running in our on-premises domain. It went into the Azure private DNS resolver. It picked up on this rule that said, hey, we want to do a DNS query against my on-prem.local, and it sends it to the IP address for the DNS server running on our on-premises network, right? So this private DNS resolver is used both to resolve DNS queries from cloud to on-premises, but also from on-premises to cloud in kind of a bi-directional fashion. So that completes our smoke testing and shows all the functionality that I was hoping to demonstrate. So I hope that was useful for you, and we'll see you in the next video.